I guess every man in history asks that question once in a while in relation to their loved ones. You see, I know my wife is cheating on me, she just doesn't know that I know. I had a fairly normal upbringing, 2 parents that loved me and an older sister who put up with me. My parents were big believers in equality and education, so I ended up at a private school. It was a strictly all-boys institution that emphasized football, religion, and education in that order. Next to our school was a private all-girls school which we had some interaction with. I can't tell you that there is anything worse than being at a Catholic school when you're not Catholic, except for being a middle-class or poor boy among snobby rich boys. To say I didn't fit in would be an understatement. I never liked snobs and still don't. I believe everyone is equal and should be judged by their actions, not their bank balance. Well, that was the wrong attitude at that school, and before long, I was picked on as the poor boy. I found myself in endless fights after school, both verbal and physical, often 4 or 5 against 1. I managed to land a few good punches, but generally I ended up on the losing side. I knew it was pointless to talk to my folks about it, as they would just tell me to turn the other cheek and fit in. The school insisted that everyone participate in a sporting activity either through the school or outside of it. Given the school's good connection with the police, due to the police chief's son attending the school, I decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and signed up for boxing classes run by the police boys club, which the school approved. This decision changed my life for several reasons. Firstly, the rich boys all played football and didn't want to mix with the lower class, so I ended up with kids just like me from all around town. The second and more important reason is that I met my best friend, Greg Sands. He was a talented boxer and the son of a cop. He had just arrived in town and signed up for class just for fun. The instructor had no idea that Greg was a regional boxing champion, and since we were of similar size, he paired us up for a sparring session. The last thing I remember before the lights went out was a smile and a big red fist coming at me. I woke up to white light in a room at the back of the gym with a sore head, wondering what had happened. The instructor stopped by and said he had assessed my talent and that it was going to be a long road. The next minute, Greg Sands came by to apologize for knocking me out. He extended his hand and we shook, becoming friends from that moment on. I took him around town, introduced him to my friends and family, and I met his folks as well. The surprise came the following week at school when, lo and behold, there was Greg in the hallway. I raced up to him with a grin and he returned it. It turns out that, due to his dad being the deputy chief, he got a reduced-cost education at the school. We became thick as thieves, taking many of the same classes together and being inseparable. As my folks like to say, Sam, as I came to call him, was like the brother I never had. The bully problem sorted itself out as well. Sam was giving me extra training, and combined with the twice-weekly classes, I was becoming a pretty decent boxer. It all came to a head one afternoon when Douglas Peterson started talking trash about my family. Now, I can take most things, but not when it comes to speaking that way about my loved ones. I went nuts, breaking Dee's nose and knocking some of his teeth out. The next moment, I saw all his friends coming up the rear. What they didn't see was Sam. To say it was an epic battle would be an understatement. Sam made short work of most of my foes while I was busy watching him and giving Douglas a few well-timed kicks in his ribs. Sam was always kind and loving towards his family and friends, but he was outright fierce with his enemies. We made short work of a few more reinforcements and left, thinking nothing more of it. I mean, they had done this sort of thing to me many times and I usually just let it go. I would then plot my revenge, often with 0 results. I guess it's never a good thing to make rich enemies. Douglas's father was a powerful man in industry and he was furious. He first had myself and Sam suspended for the remainder of the year. There was only a month left of classes anyway. He then had us charged with assault. What the captain of industry didn't reckon on were witnesses from the girls' school who totally backed our version of events, that Doug started the whole thing. It also helped that Sam's dad was the deputy chief. Mr. Peterson later tried to make my folks pay for the reconstructive surgery, but the assault charges were overturned, though the suspension remained in force for the rest of the month. I had to work at my dad's hardware store to keep me out of trouble. The summer before school started again was a good one. Sam and I hung out, hit the gym pretty hard, and took up running together. He tried to get to know my older sister, but she was about to leave for college and wasn't interested in anything with a high school student. Life went on pretty much like that for the remainder of school. Douglas Peterson vowed revenge, but I knew it wouldn't be physical as he had met his match and no one wanted to mess with Sam. In our last year of school, things were going well. Sam became the heavyweight state champion and I did okay, coming in the top 10 in my division. Sam seriously considered turning pro but didn't want to end up like his uncle who became broken and bitter from boxing. We were both beginning to date girls from the neighboring school, and now that we had cars, we spent a lot of time cruising around with our dates. I experienced my first intimate relationship with Susan Bates. While it wasn't love, it was certainly memorable. In the background, Douglas Peterson was watching me. He had never forgiven me for his humiliation. I never understood him. He had everything, money, looks, and power, but he was never happy unless he was hurting someone. Deep down, he was a coward, and he knew it. His revenge came swiftly that final year. He was under the mistaken impression that I was in love with Susan. Behind my back, he wooed her, and she ended up dumping me. The next thing I knew, he announced at school that Susan was now his girlfriend. It was a match made in heaven, as the Bates and Petersons were the two richest families in town. He had the look of a cat that got the cream every time he saw me. Sam and I laughed about it, knowing I wouldn't be going on to higher education as my family just couldn't afford it. So, decisions had to be made, and as usual, Sam and I discussed it. We both decided that the Army was the way to go and enlisted. We ended up missing the prom due to basic training, but it didn't bother either of us. As soon as we got to basic, I knew I wasn't cut out to be in the Army for any longer than my sign-up time. Sam, on the other hand, was born to be in uniform. He loved it. Basic was fine, I just did what I was told, and as usual, I had Sam helping me up if I fell. Finally, at the end of basic, we graduated and returned home for some rest and relaxation. I had 2 weeks before I had to report for officer training. I was going to be an officer and a gentleman. Sam teased me relentlessly about it, but I knew I was smart enough to pursue my business degree. Sam was going into special forces. I never doubted it. When he committed to anything, he followed through. This would be the first time in years that I wouldn't have my good buddy with me, and I didn't realize that I wouldn't see Sam again for many years. Officer training was a breeze. There was a lot of classroom work, but I enjoyed the practical work more. The most exciting thing for me was that once I completed officer training, I could start my business degree. I finished my training and suddenly found myself as Second Lieutenant Roger Easton. There were a couple of drawbacks regarding the business degree, though. Firstly, I had to commit more time to the Army, adding an extra 3 years on top of the 4 years I had initially signed up for. Secondly, I would be based out of the Army History Unit, which meant office work, and I wouldn't be out in the field anytime soon. The office pretty much ran itself. I had a fantastic sergeant who basically managed the place, and I let him do his job. The sergeant had seen action in Iraq and had been injured in an attack, but he had a real love for the Army and its traditions. This passion soon became infectious, and I gained a real insight into our Army history and traditions. I hadn't heard from Sam for a while. He was overseas, as he liked to put it. I worried for him, but I knew he was well trained, and as he said, when your time's up, it's up. This was the first time I felt really stable. I was studying for my degree, had set work hours, and was still boxing when I could. Funnily enough, it felt more like I worked for a bank than the Army. The only thing really missing from my life was a good woman. I was a romantic at heart and had dated a few women. While those relationships were enjoyable, I didn't have much in common with them, so they never lasted. This was all soon to change when I traveled back to my hometown for the weekend of a big music festival. I wanted to see my folks and Sam's family and maybe catch up with a few friends. While having a few brews on Friday night, I caught up with everyone and heard the latest news. My dad was considering selling the hardware store and retiring. Meanwhile, Sam's parents were supportive of his dad taking over as police chief, and they hadn't heard from Sam since everything was still hush-hush over there. I woke up early Saturday morning and went for my run. After showering and getting dressed, I enjoyed a nice breakfast prepared by my mom. I then helped my dad open the store, and that's when my life took a turn. Roger Easton. I turned around to see Susan Bates standing next to a gorgeous brunette. "Hey, Susan. How are you?" I replied. "I'm good, but it's Susan Peterson now," she said. I was surprised to hear that Doug had actually married her. She went on to explain that she was visiting with her cousin Kelly for the festival while Doug was overseas on a business trip. Susan introduced me to Kelly, who was stunning. I wondered what two beautiful women were doing in a hardware store, but apparently Susan had seen me and came in before their hair appointment next door. I promised to meet them at the festival to catch up. My dad saw the exchange and laughed, reminding me to watch myself as Susan was known to be flirtatious. I shrugged it off, thinking that I only had eyes for Kelly. After catching up with a few friends, I went home, cleaned up, had some lunch, and headed to the festival where the atmosphere was lively. Sure enough, I spotted Susan and Kelly. Kelly looked a bit uncomfortable as Susan flirted with every man who came close. I greeted Kelly with a smile, while Susan, clearly enjoying herself, gave me an enthusiastic kiss and said, "Looks like you need something to eat, Roger." I assured her I was fine. We found a table and I bought drinks and food for the three of us. For the next hour, I listened to Susan talk about her life. She shared that she married Doug right after graduation because he had gotten her pregnant, but fortunately she lost the baby early on. Doug was working in his father's business and frequently traveled for work as his father was in poor health and Doug would soon take over. After a while, Susan felt the tension and wandered off with Peter Morrison, the ex-police chief's son, to check out his new car. I laughed, thinking that was the last I'd see of her. Cousin Kelly asked what was so funny and I just said Susan hadn't changed much. I then enjoyed getting to know Kelly better. She was raised on an army base and worked as a human resources manager for a large corporation, clearly the Peterson Corporation, since Susan had helped her get a foot in the door. We talked about family, my work, and discovered we had a lot in common. We ended up going to dinner, and it was exciting to learn that we lived and worked in the same city. By the end of the night, we exchanged numbers and promised to meet again. That night, I fell asleep a very happy man. Things progressed rapidly from there. We started dating and grew closer. Before I knew it, we'd been together for almost 2 years. Kelly was old-fashioned and wanted to wait until marriage before being intimate. I agreed, but it became quite frustrating. On the plus side, we got to know each other very well. The only sour note was Susan Peterson's involvement in our lives and the shadow of Doug always lingering nearby. Kelly knew how I felt about Doug and Susan, but for her sake, I kept my opinions to myself. I met Kelly's family, and although I felt out of my league, they tolerated me. I think it helped that I was an officer in the Army, which gave me some common ground with Kelly's father, a retired general. After completing my degree, I proposed to Kelly and she accepted. I did the right thing and asked her father for permission, which he agreed to, but her mother was not too pleased and suggested I might be just a starter husband. My folks liked Kelly. She was down to earth, and even though she came from money, she didn't flaunt it. Of course, a prenuptial agreement was signed before the wedding at her mother's insistence. I had a feeling that somehow Doug Peterson had put this idea in Susan's head and it had been passed down to Kelly. The wedding went off well. Sadly, Sam couldn't be there as he was still uncontactable. I got his younger brother to stand in for him as best man. Thankfully, Doug was overseas and didn't come. It was a good day and an even better night as Kelly and I discovered we were as compatible in private as we were in public. Life continued as expected. We bought a nice house in a good neighborhood, enjoyed our time together, and started discussing the future. We both wanted kids, but first, I had to decide between the Army or a civilian lifestyle. In the end, we agreed I should use my degree and I started looking for a new career. I got lucky when a major bank needed someone to run their internal and external security. The job paid twice what I was making in the Army, so I submitted my resignation and moved on. We began trying for kids right away, but it just didn't happen. I knew I was under pressure and working longer hours, but I sensed there had to be more to it. After a visit to the doctor, I received the bad news. I was sterile. I dreaded telling Kelly as she really wanted children. I thought about looking into adoption, getting the facts, and maybe taking her on a cruise to break the news. However, that plan went awry when I surprised her with the cruise and she told me she had been promoted. She was now reporting directly to the CEO of Peterson Corporation, Mr. Doug Peterson. Doug had asked her, as the head of human resources, to accompany him on a tour of their businesses across the states for some layoffs. I felt uneasy about this, but what could I say? Kelly assured me Doug had changed from his high school days and was all business, but I had my doubts. The morning she left, Doug showed up in a limo with a big grin and a wave to me. Kelly kissed me goodbye and promised to call when she could. I spent the next few days sulking. When Kelly finally called, she insisted everything was fine and that Doug was completely professional. That Saturday morning, while having breakfast, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a well-tanned individual standing there, Sam. I couldn't believe my eyes. He looked different, more hardened and world-weary, but it was good to see each other again. We shared a hug and settled in for a drink. When he asked where Kelly was, I told him she was out of town on a business trip. I was more interested in hearing about his adventures. Sam told me about his travels and his time in the Special Forces. He had seen some intense situations. He then revealed he had left the Army tired of the killing. At 28, he felt he had done enough and wanted out. I caught him up on my life, including Kelly and her connection to Doug Peterson. We even shared a laugh about Susan marrying Doug. As the evening wore on, I showed him my wedding photos and he suddenly had a strange look on his face. "Holy, that's General Bates," he said. I was surprised he knew him and learned that he had been Sam's commander when he first joined Special Forces. Sam revealed some interesting tidbits about Mrs. Bates and her connections to some of the general's officers. I was taken aback by this revelation and questioned how the general could stay married to someone with such a reputation. Sam explained it was all about power and control. I asked Sam to stay the night, but he had to leave. He informed me he was reporting to the police academy for training on Monday. He was becoming a cop, like his father. He promised to come over when Kelly returned. I had a lot to think about. I was already concerned about Doug and Kelly's relationship, and now I learned that her mother had a questionable reputation just like her cousin Susan. The other thing that concerned me was Sam. He seemed different, having changed dramatically in both appearance and attitude. I hadn't seen him for nearly 10 years, so I figured I was being too harsh. People change, after all. He had just returned and everything was likely overwhelming for him. Meanwhile, I had more pressing troubles on my mind regarding Kelly and the revelations about her mother. The next week passed quickly as I kept busy at work, and Kelly called a couple of times. I was too preoccupied to dwell on my concerns about Doug and Kelly, knowing she would be back Friday night. Sure enough, around 8 p.m. that Friday, Kelly arrived home in a limo. She greeted me with a warm kiss and a hug, expressing how happy she was to see me. I looked for any signs of change in her mannerisms, but she seemed the same old Kelly. After she went upstairs for a shower, I took her bags to the laundry. Unable to resist, I glanced through her bags but found nothing out of the ordinary. We enjoyed a late dinner together and spent the night reconnecting. I loved this woman deeply. The next morning, we woke up around 10 a.m. and had a late breakfast. I caught Kelly up on Sam's return and expressed my desire for her to meet him. I called Sam and he promised to come over in the afternoon. Around 2 p.m. when he arrived, he brought flowers and a bottle of good wine. I was about to introduce him to Kelly when she exclaimed, "Oh my God, Greg. It's Sam." I was taken aback. It turned out they knew each other from the army base where her father had been in charge. For the next few hours, they caught up on their shared experiences and I felt like a third wheel. I ended up cooking dinner and came back into the living room just as I overheard them discussing something in hushed tones. Sam suddenly stood up to leave, mentioning that Kelly and I needed to talk first, leaving me curious about what had just transpired. Once he was gone, I asked Kelly what was going on. She seemed a bit embarrassed and revealed that she and Sam had briefly dated while he was stationed there. They had broken up when he left for a tour of duty. I couldn't help but feel uneasy about this revelation, especially when Sam's expression changed after looking at our wedding photos. It became clear that he still had feelings for her. I asked Kelly if this would be a problem, and she reassured me that she loved me and only me. Still, I was frustrated that neither of them had mentioned their past. I called Sam, who echoed Kelly's sentiments, explaining that he didn't want to upset or worry me with past events. Life continued, with Kelly busier than ever in her new role, and our plans for children took a backseat. I didn't mention my concerns about being sterile. Sam graduated and started his career as a police officer working in the drug squad. I was also busy with my job at the bank, but slowly things started changing at home. Our intimacy shifted from 3 times a week to once a week, and then it dwindled to once every couple of weeks. This coincided with Kelly's late nights at work with Doug and various overnight business trips. I sensed something was wrong. Determined to clear my head, I decided to take a week off to help my father, who had recently retired and sold his business. Kelly encouraged me, saying it would be a good opportunity since she had to work late with Doug and some other executives. I arrived at my parents' place on Monday around 10 a.m. After spending the day at the store, we went to the Irish pub for a few drinks. I tried to avoid discussing my worries until my dad surprised me with some unexpected advice. "Son, I think you should start protecting yourself ASAP," he said seriously. I asked him what he meant, and he looked me in the eye, revealing that there were rumors circulating around town. He explained that Doug Peterson was telling everyone that he was having an affair with Kelly. My anger boiled over. It was one thing to suspect infidelity, but to hear it directly was another. Everything began to add up, and I realized I had been naive. I couldn't shake my earlier question about how far an apple falls from the tree. I would make them all pay for making a fool of me. First things first, I was going to make an unannounced visit to Susan Peterson. The Bates estate was the biggest place in town, a mansion everyone called the White House because of its size. As I headed back to the city, I heard that Susan was actually at her parents' place. I knew her parents fairly well from when I dated their daughter in high school. They were decent people, but I knew they never considered me good enough for Susan. She often told me that her parents just wanted her to date me to get it out of her system. When I got to the main house, I found Susan sitting on the porch. "I heard a rumor you were in town. Trouble in paradise?" I said. "I could say the same to you," she replied. No, I'm just here to help my dad close up his business. Susan didn't look great, she seemed pale and nervous. She offered me a drink and a nice cold beer sounded perfect. So, what brings you here? She asked. I got straight to the point. Is Doug seeing my wife? Jesus, you don't mess around, Roger. Yeah, well, it's all around town, I said. Susan started crying and explained that she had left Doug and was now living back at her parents' house. Their divorce was only a matter of time. She told me they had been forced into marriage and resented each other. Doug had started seeing other women right away and didn't bother to hide it. In fact, she told me he had a nice apartment near his office where he brought his conquests. Being Susan, she retaliated by having affairs of her own. Doug had been pushing for a divorce for the last 2 years, but Susan held off on her mom's advice. Everything came to a head last week when Doug admitted he was sleeping with Kelly and said it wouldn't be long before Kelly moved in on his side of the bed. Enough was enough, and Susan packed up and left. As we talked more, she shed a few tears for Doug's role in my marriage problems, but I was beyond caring about sympathy from a Peterson or a Bates. Susan vowed to make Doug pay, but I wanted to ensure my revenge on my terms. I wished her well and hoped that would be the last time I ever spoke to her. When I got home, my folks were out for dinner and there was a note saying Kelly needed to talk urgently. I thought, screw that, grabbed a cold beer and headed out to the deck. I switched on my mobile phone and saw several missed calls and messages, but I couldn't deal with it today, so I switched it back off. My parents came home around 10 p.m. and by then I was on my 9th beer. The phone had been ringing nonstop all night, so I ended up taking it off the hook. Dad joined me for a beer and I staggered off to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a headache and the smell of bacon and eggs cooking. God bless all the mothers of the world. After breakfast, I headed to the store with Dad to do the final handover with the new owner. We said a sad farewell to the store and were back home in time for lunch. After lunch, Dad and I went fishing. We had a good talk and he agreed that I should confront this issue head-on and be done with it. The fish weren't biting, so we returned home early and Kelly's new BMW was parked in the driveway. I steadied myself and walked into the house with Dad. Kelly was in the lounge with a box of tissues talking to my mom. My mom looked at me and asked Dad to take her to the store, then they would visit their friends, the Browns, for dinner. Once they left, I asked Kelly if she wanted a drink. She said no, so I got a beer from the fridge. As I returned, Kelly ran into my arms and started crying, saying she needed to talk to me. She began by explaining that Susan had called her yesterday about the impending divorce and wanted to thank her for making me available again. Kelly was confused about what Susan meant, so she immediately started calling me, leaving endless messages, none of which I returned. After a few days, Kelly drove straight to my parents' place to talk. As the waterworks started again, I had steeled myself for the truth. I asked her outright if she was having an affair with Doug. Kelly swore she wasn't, claiming their late meetings included several other executives. I confronted her about the rumors around town and she was ready for that too. She insisted it wasn't Doug starting those rumors, but Susan, who wanted to break us up. Kelly claimed that Susan still loved me and only broke up with me in high school due to the pressure placed on her by her parents. She also said she had spoken with Doug and would no longer be attending any late-night meetings. While the story sounded good in theory, I thought it was a bunch of nonsense. Firstly, I'm no expert on women, but I knew Susan did not love me. I was just a fleeting interest during high school. Susan loved money and power, and I offered neither. Secondly, I knew Doug Peterson and he hated me, he would do anything to spite me. Thirdly, the women Doug dated had a track record of infidelity. No, this was a fantasy and I needed evidence to confront her. In my mind, Kelly was now the enemy, but I had to play my cards close to my chest and let her believe all was forgiven and that I was no longer suspicious. I gave Kelly a kiss and a hug, and suffice it to say, the performance I put on made it seem like all was soon forgiven. I took Kelly out for dinner that night, and thankfully she was too tired for anything more intimate. The next morning, she left early, happy and smiling. After talking to my folks about Christmas arrangements, I told her I loved her and would see her in a couple of days. After we finalized the arrangements with the store, Dad looked at me funny but was smart enough not to say anything. With Kelly gone, I placed a call to Sam. It was time to get him involved in the surveillance on Kelly. I left him a message saying it was urgent we talk. While waiting for my friend to call back, I had a quiet word with Dad and asked him to tell Kelly that I was staying there until Sunday. Knowing Kelly would be at work, I left a message on the answering machine at home saying I would be at my folks' place until Sunday as Dad still needed further help with the store. With that done, I packed my car, said goodbye, and headed back to the city. Sam still hadn't returned my call, but no matter. I got back to the city in the mid-afternoon and checked into a hotel close enough to work but far enough away that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew or, more importantly, anyone Kelly knew. Once I checked in, I went into work to say hello and asked my boss if I could have another week off. He told me it was no problem. While at the bank, I organized a new bank account in my name only and transferred half of our joint savings into my account, ensuring all future pay would go there. I felt a bit better having some walk-around money and enough for any unexpected costs that might arise. I then went back to the hotel and tried Sam again, but still no luck. I decided to go down to the bar for a cold beer. I started talking with the bartender when my phone rang. I excused myself and answered. It was just my dad checking to see that I got back to the city okay. I returned to talking with the bartender and had a few more drinks. By 2 p.m. I decided 3 beers were enough, paid my tab, and left. I went back to my room, had a shower, changed clothes, and decided to have a late lunch. Just as I left my room, my phone rang again. It was Sam. He apologized for taking so long, but work came first as he had just been made a detective. I must say, it seemed awfully quick for him to achieve that, but he was well trained. I asked Sam if he was free. He laughed and said he had just finished work, so we decided to meet at a local bar. When I got to the bar, I found out it was a local cop hangout. We found a booth at the back and ordered a couple of beers. After our beers came, I sat down and explained my concerns to my friend. I told him about Kelly and Doug, the rumors, the trips away, the apartment building, and Kelly's change in attention toward me. Sam took it all in stride, sipped his beer, and then asked, "Left or right knee?" "I'll take care of him for you." I started laughing and told him I'd rather deal with Doug directly. We then got down to serious business. First off, I had to play it cool and keep Kelly clueless, continuing to act as if everything was normal. Next, we needed evidence or confirmation that she was involved with Doug. Then we would confront him. Sam told me to leave it with him. He knew some people and would get back to me with the required information. He admitted he was surprised as he didn't pick Kelly as someone who would cheat. I responded that neither did I, or I wouldn't have married her. We then proceeded to catch up, reminiscing about the old days until the wee hours of the morning. I woke up Friday morning with a huge hangover and an urge to vomit. After a shower and breakfast, I started to feel somewhat human again. I remembered Sam saying that I should act normally around Kelly and be the same loving husband. Based on that, I canceled my leave for the following week and called Kelly to tell her I would be home that night. I was welcomed home with open arms, had a nice dinner, and attempted to be intimate with my wife. She questioned why I wanted to use protection and then talked me out of it. Kelly told me she was ready for children and that we should start that night. I remained silent, knowing she wouldn't be getting any children from me. Life continued and I was on pins and needles, awaiting Sam to get back to me. It's hard to plan for the future when you don't know if you're doing it alone. A couple of weeks later, Kelly phoned me, questioning our joint bank account balance. I fabricated a story about lending money to my dad and assured her that when he sold the house, we would get the money back. She seemed satisfied with that answer. As the weeks dragged on into a month, my worry grew. I left a few messages for Sam, but he urged me not to worry, saying he was onto something. With Christmas fast approaching, I wanted this sorted out before the end of the year. Early in December, I received a call from Sam asking to meet. We ended up back at the cop hangout, ironically in the same booth. Sam was all smiles, which eased my tension. After some small talk, he passed over an envelope. "Open it, it's good news," he said. Inside was a private investigation report on Kelly Easton and a thicker one on Doug Peterson. The good news was that Kelly was in the clear. She had been followed for a month and the report showed she went from home to work, had lunch with girlfriends, and returned home each day. I was the only man in her life, apart from our 2-year-old border collie, Buddy. Doug Peterson, however, was a different story. The report revealed he was a notorious playboy involved in questionable activities to support a growing gambling and drug habit. Sam knew his supplier, and Doug was on the verge of being busted for cocaine. I couldn't have asked for a better Christmas present. I celebrated with drinks at the bar and headed home to my loving wife. When I got home, Kelly was affectionate and we shared a passionate evening. Afterward, she turned to me and said she had a surprise. "Darling, you're going to be a father." I looked stunned, processing her words. She misinterpreted my expression as joy, beaming at me while I felt a mix of disbelief and concern. Kelly started talking about nursery preparations and maternity leave, but I zoned out. Realizing I had been made a fool of was disheartening, but I quickly gathered my thoughts. The Army had taught me to be logical, so I figured things out swiftly. The only question was what I was going to do about it. I felt physically ill lying next to Kelly that night. One thing was clear, she was out for herself and I needed to act. I couldn't believe she would pass off the baby as our intimacy had been practically non-existent. Tossing and turning for hours, I watched Kelly sleep peacefully and I felt a surge of anger. Instead of dwelling on my frustrations, I went downstairs to my study. I glanced at my gun but dismissed such thoughts as weak. Over the years, I came to some hard truths. The baby wasn't mine, my wife had betrayed me, Sam was my worst enemy, and Doug Peterson had been set up by Sam. Coming to terms with my life being a lie was excruciating. It felt terrible to be surrounded by enemies. I was a loyal and trusting person. Was that a crime? I needed to make quick decisions. Taking Sam's advice to heart, I knew I had to make everyone think I was oblivious while sorting this out tactically. I had to speak to Doug Peterson. With that decision made, I returned to bed, attempting to find some rest. I woke early the next morning, filled with purpose. Kelly was still asleep, so I quietly left for the day.